Imagine the only princess of Earth's most powerful kingdom being brutally violated by her own brother. And her father, the giant-slaying warrior king, does
The time
absolutely
has
nothing.
come. We cannot
Tamar
wait.
wore the sacred
Follow me now
colorful
to our
robes
destiny.
reserved only for royal
guards are coming.
virgins when
We must go.
Amnon, David's
how? The doors are
firstborn
barred.
heir,
I know a path.
lured her
Trust
into
me.
his private chamber with a fake illness. What happened in that room wasn't just rape. It was the spark that ignited a bloody civil war and nearly destroyed Israel's entire dynasty
The
forever.
time for action is now.
But here's
I
what
am
will
ready,
shock
my lord.
you about
Then
this
let us
horrific
proceed.
story. David's deadly silence after the brutal assault wasn't weakness or negligence. It was a cold, calculated decision that reveals the darkest side of the man after God's own heart. Absalom had a sister whose name was Tamar. 2 Samuel 13:1 tells us she was beautiful. Read that again. She was beautiful. In a palace filled with servants, concubines, and royal wives, Tamar stood apart. Her beauty wasn't just physical attractiveness. It was the kind of beauty that stopped conversations when she walked through the corridors, the kind that made grown men forget their duties and young men lose their minds. And Amnon, David's firstborn son, the heir to Israel's throne, fell in love with her. Think about what this meant. Amnon wasn't just any man in the kingdom. He was the crown prince, the future king, a man who could have almost any woman he wanted. Royal marriages were arranged, concubines were available, yet none of that mattered to him now. His half-sister Tamar had captured something in him that wealth and power couldn't satisfy. The desire started as an attraction, then it became an obsession, then it became something darker. 2 Samuel 13:2 records what happened next. Amnon was so tormented that he made himself ill because of his sister Tamar, for she was a virgin, and it seemed impossible to Amnon to do anything to her. Tormented, made himself ill. These aren't the words you use to describe normal attraction or even intense romantic love. These are the words you use to describe someone being consumed from the inside. Picture what this looked like. Day after day, Amnon lay in his bed staring at the ceiling, his mind fixed on one person he couldn't have. The heir to David's throne, the man who should have been learning statecraft and military strategy, was wasting away in his chambers. His face grew pale, his clothes hung loose on his shrinking frame. Food lost its taste, sleep brought no rest, because his dreams were filled with images of Tamar. The servants whispered, the palace staff noticed. How could they not? The crown prince was disappearing before their eyes, his body consuming itself in the fire of an impossible desire. Jonadab noticed too. Jonadab was the son of Shimeah, David's brother, making him Amnon's cousin. But 2 Samuel 13:3 tells us something crucial about him. Jonadab was a very crafty man. Crafty, the Hebrew word, suggests someone clever in a dangerous way, someone who sees opportunities where others see problems, someone who finds ways to get what he wants, regardless of the cost to others. One morning, Jonadab entered Amnon's chamber and saw his cousin lying there like a dying man. The smell of unwashed clothes filled the room. Empty food trays sat untouched on the table. The future king of Israel looked like he was ready for burial. Jonadab asked directly, "Why are you, the king's son, so haggard morning after morning?" Think about that question. Morning after morning. This wasn't a bad day or a rough week. This was a pattern that had been building for months. Amnon's obsession was visible to anyone who bothered to look, and Jonadab had been watching. Amnon turned his face to the wall, his chest tight with frustration. He had carried this secret alone, letting it eat him alive day after day. But now, confronted directly by his crafty cousin, the words spilled out. "I love Tamar, my brother Absalom's sister." There it was, the confession that changed everything. Not "I'm attracted to" or "I admire." He used the word love. But this wasn't love. This was possession dressed up in romantic language. This was a man who had decided he needed something and was willing to destroy himself to get it. Jonadab listened in silence, but his mind was already working. He saw the desperation in Amnon's eyes, the way Amnon's hands shook when he spoke Tamar's name. He understood that Tamar was a virgin, carefully guarded in the palace, protected by her status as a royal daughter. He knew that approaching her directly was impossible. Most importantly, he knew an opportunity when he saw one. The room fell silent after Amnon's confession. The heir to the David throne lay there, exposed, vulnerable, having revealed the secret that was killing him. Jonadab stood quietly, calculating, planning. In that silence, something dark was taking shape. Amnon's obsession had found its enabler. His impossible desire was about to become a devastating reality. The seed of the plan was planted in that moment, in that quiet room between two cousins who had just crossed a line they could never uncross. Jonadab broke the silence with calculated precision. His voice was steady, confident, as if the solution had been obvious all along. "Lie down on your bed and pretend to be ill," he told Amnon, "and when your father comes to see you, say to him, 'Please let my sister Tamar come and give me bread to eat, and prepare the food in my sight, that I may see it and eat it from her hand.'" 2 Samuel 13:5 records these exact words. Read that carefully. This wasn't a spontaneous suggestion born of concern for his cousin's well-being. This was a trap, methodically planned and perfectly baited. Jonadab had studied the situation, analyzed the players, and found the one weakness that could be exploited: David's love for his children. Amnon listened with the desperate attention of a drowning man being thrown a rope. This was the answer he had been searching for through months of torment. A way to get Tamar alone, a way to be near her without suspicion, a way to have what he wanted. He obeyed immediately. Amnon pulled the heavy linens up to his chin and arranged himself on the bed like an invalid. He practiced the weak voice, the labored breathing, the pale complexion that would sell the deception. The heir to Israel's throne was about to become an actor in a performance that would destroy lives.
98. She understood that words might be her only weapon, and she used them like a lawyer making a case for her life. "Such a thing should not be done in Israel," she cried out, invoking the moral foundation of their nation. Think about what she was doing in the midst of terror. She was appealing to Amnon's sense of right and wrong, to the laws that govern their people, to the very identity of who they were as Israelites. Picture the desperation in her voice as she spoke these words. This wasn't abstract theology or legal theory. This was a woman fighting for her very existence, using every argument she could think of to reach whatever humanity remained in her attacker. She was reminding him that they weren't pagans who did whatever they pleased. They were children of Abraham, descendants of those who had received the law at Sinai. Their people had moral standards that separated them from the surrounding nations. "Do not do this wicked thing," she continued, her voice growing more desperate with each word. The Hebrew word for wicked here carries the weight of abomination, the same term used for the sins that brought divine judgment upon Sodom and Gomorrah. Amnon understood the magnitude of what Amnon was contemplating, and she was trying to make him understand it too. Her mind was working frantically, even as her body struggled against his grip. She could feel his strength overwhelming her physical resistance, so she poured everything into her words, hoping that somewhere in the obsessed man holding her down, there remained enough of her brother to hear reason. Then came her most remarkable argument. Even as panic filled her chest, even as she fought against his crushing grip, Amnon made an offer that revealed both her desperation and her wisdom. "Please speak to the king. He will not refuse me to you." Think about what she was saying in that moment. Amnon was offering to become Amnon's wife rather than his victim. She was proposing a solution that would satisfy his desire while preserving her honor and following proper protocols. Marriage between half-siblings wasn't common in Israel, but it wasn't absolutely forbidden either. Abraham had married his half-sister Sarah. The precedent existed. This wasn't just quick thinking under pressure. This was Tamar offering Amnon everything he claimed to want, but in the right way. She was giving him a path to have her without destroying her, without committing a crime that would haunt both of them forever. She was showing him how his obsession could be satisfied through honor rather than violence. Imagine the courage it took to make that offer. She was essentially proposing to sacrifice her own future happiness to prevent something worse from happening. She was willing to marry a man she now knew was capable of violence, willing to become the wife of someone who had just shown her his true nature if it meant avoiding the devastation of rape. David might indeed have agreed to such an arrangement if properly approached. The king had made political marriages before. He understood that royal families sometimes needed to form alliances that common people wouldn't consider. If Amnon had gone to his father honestly, admitted his feelings, and requested Tamar's hand in marriage, there was a real possibility David would have consented. But that would have required patience. It would have required treating Tamar as a person with rights rather than an object to be possessed. It would have required acknowledging that she had a choice in the matter, that her consent mattered, that her future happiness was worth considering. Amnon heard every word of her plea. He understood exactly what she was offering, and he rejected it completely. The heir to David's throne had passed the point where honor mattered. He had moved beyond love, beyond marriage, beyond doing things the right way. What he wanted now wasn't Tamar as a wife. It was the satisfaction of taking what he had obsessed over, regardless of the cost to her or to anyone else. His response was to tighten his grip and ignore her words entirely. Amnon's strength overwhelmed her arguments, just as it overwhelmed her physical resistance. Tamar pushed against his chest with her free hand, trying to create distance, trying to break his hold on her body. Her fingers clawed at his clothing, searching for anything that might give her leverage to escape. But Amnon was larger, stronger, and driven by months of pent-up obsession that had now found its moment of release. The careful planning with Jonadab, the elaborate deception with David, the weeks of pretending to be ill, all of it had led to this moment when he would take by force what he could have received through patience and honor. He used his body weight to force her down onto the bed. The mattress, which had been his place of supposed weakness, now became the site where his true nature was revealed. Tamar's feet kicked frantically as she tried to find purchase, tried to escape the trap she had walked into with such innocent intentions. The irony was devastating. She had come to this room to help heal someone she thought was sick. Instead, she had discovered that the sickness was far worse than anyone had imagined. Not a physical illness that food and care could cure, but a moral corruption that had eaten away at her brother's soul until nothing remained but selfish desire and the willingness to destroy others to satisfy it. Her beautiful virgin's robe, the colorful garment that marked her status as an untouched daughter of the king, tore at the shoulder as she struggled. The sound of ripping fabric filled the room like a prophecy of everything else that was about to be torn apart. Her innocence, her future, her place in the royal family, her very sense of who she was in the world. That robe was more than clothing. It was a symbol of her purity, her value in the marriage market, her protected status as a royal virgin. When it tore, it was like watching her entire future unravel in real time. Amnon pressed his hand over her mouth, silencing the cries that might bring help. The same mouth that had just offered him everything through proper marriage was now being covered by the hand of someone who preferred to take by force what could have been given through honor. The contrast was sickening. Her lips had just spoken words of reason and compromise, and now they were being forcibly silenced. Tamar bit down on his hand, trying to free herself to scream again. The metallic taste of his blood filled her mouth as she fought with the desperation of someone who understood that these might be her last moments of having any control over what happened to her body. The bite made Amnon curse, but it didn't make him stop. His eyes had taken on the look of someone no longer fully rational. The months of obsession had built to this moment like water behind a dam, and nothing, not her words, not her resistance, not her offers of marriage, not her tears, was going to stop him from taking what he had convinced himself he deserved. 2 Samuel 13:14 tells us the terrible truth. But he would not listen to her,
and being stronger than she, he forced her and lay with her. He would not listen. Think about those words. Amnon heard every argument, every plea, every reasonable alternative she offered. He understood exactly what he was doing and exactly what it would cost to her, to himself, to their family, to the kingdom, and he chose to do it anyway. The violation happened there, on that bed, in that room, where the smell of fresh bread still lingered in the air, where the cakes she had lovingly prepared for her supposedly sick brother lay scattered and forgotten on the floor. The caring sister who had come to heal was being destroyed by the very person she had come to serve. Tamar felt the sharp physical pain of the assault.
But that was nothing compared to the deeper agony of understanding what was being stolen from her. Her virginity, which could never be restored. Her honor, which in that culture was everything. Her future marriage prospects, which were now destroyed. Her place in society as a respected royal daughter. All of it was being ripped away in those horrible moments. Her body eventually stopped fighting, not from consent, but from exhaustion and the crushing realization that resistance was futile. There comes a point when the human spirit can only endure so much, when the flesh simply cannot continue, when survival instinct forces a terrible stillness that shouldn't be mistaken for acceptance. When it was over, Amnon rolled away from her, his breathing heavy, but his obsession suddenly and completely satisfied. The desire that had consumed him for months, that had made him physically ill, that had driven him to elaborate deception and calculated violence, it was gone. Just like that, as if a fever had broken. The room fell into a silence so heavy it seemed to press down on everything in it. The only sounds were their breathing, his satisfied and settling, hers shallow and broken, and the distant noises of palace life continuing outside, oblivious to the catastrophe that had just occurred. Tamar lay motionless, tears streaming down her face onto the pillow that still carried the scent of the man who had just destroyed her life. The tears weren't just from physical pain, though that was real and sharp. They were tears of humiliation, of betrayal, of the devastating realization that someone she had trusted had planned and executed her destruction with cold calculation. Something was happening to Amnon's face as he stared at the ceiling. The months of desperate longing were over. The obsession that had driven him to sickness was satisfied, but instead of the peace or happiness he might have expected, something else was taking root in his heart. The satisfaction was fading, replaced by something unexpected and terrible. Where obsessive desire had burned for months, where desperate need had consumed his thoughts day and night, a new emotion was growing like a dark flower in poisoned soil. Hatred. The violation had marked the end of Tamar's innocence, but it had also marked the beginning of something else, a darkness in Amnon's heart that would prove to be as destructive as his original obsession, and far more dangerous to everyone around him. The hatred came like a flood breaking through a dam. 2 Samuel 13:15 tells us exactly what happened. Then Amnon hated her exceedingly, so that the hatred with which he hated her was greater than the love with which he has loved her. Read that again. The hatred was greater than the love. Think about what this means. For months, Amnon's obsession had consumed him so completely that it made him physically sick. It had driven him to elaborate deception, to careful planning, to violent assault. That desire had been the most powerful force in his life, and now the hatred was even stronger. This wasn't gradual disillusionment or slow-growing regret. This was instant, overwhelming revulsion that hit him like a physical blow the moment his obsession was satisfied. The woman he had claimed to love, the sister he had destroyed his health pursuing, had suddenly become the most despised person in his world. Amnon's voice cut through the heavy silence like a blade. "Get up, get out." The tone was harsh, commanding, filled with disgust. This wasn't the weak invalid who had pleaded for his sister's care. This was a man in full possession of his strength, using it now to inflict a different kind of cruelty. Tamar, still lying motionless on the bed where her innocence had been destroyed, lifted her head in shock. The sudden transformation in Amnon's demeanor was almost as dramatic as what had just happened to her. The brother who had forced himself on her was now treating her like something contaminated, something that
requesting justice or demanding that Amnon face consequences. She was simply begging not to be discarded completely. She understood that her life as she had known it was over, but she was pleading for the minimal protection that remaining in his household might provide. But Amnon's heart had turned to stone. The satisfaction of his obsession had been followed immediately by revulsion, and that revulsion extended to everything associated with what he had just done, including Tamar herself. He couldn't bear to look at her, couldn't stand to have her presence reminding him of his actions. "Servant," he called out in a loud voice. The door opened immediately, and his personal attendant entered quickly. The man had been waiting outside, probably wondering about the strange sounds and voices he had heard from within. When he saw the scene, Amnon on the bed, Tamar with her torn robe, the scattered food on the floor, he understood immediately that something terrible had happened. Amnon pointed at Tamar with disgust, as if she were refuse that needed to be removed. "Put this woman out, away from me, and bolt the door after her. This woman, not my sister, not even Tamar. She had been reduced to this woman, as if her very identity had been erased along with her innocence. The prince who had claimed to love her beyond reason now spoke of her as if she were a stranger, an intruder who had somehow found her way into his private chambers." The servant moved to obey without question. This was the crown prince giving orders, and the destruction in the room made it clear that refusing would be dangerous. He grabbed Tamar by her injured arm, the same arm Amnon had gripped and twisted during the assault. Tamar tried to pull her torn robe together, attempting to cover herself with the fabric that had been ripped in the struggle. The beautiful garment that had marked her as a virgin daughter of the king was now evidence of violence, its bright colors stained and its careful weaving destroyed. The servant dragged her toward the door, and Tamar's feet stumbled beneath her. The physical trauma combined with the emotional devastation had left her weak and disoriented. She was being expelled from the very room where she had come to show mercy to someone she thought needed healing. The heavy door slammed shut behind her with a finality that echoed through the corridors. Then came the sound that sealed her fate, the iron bolt sliding into place with a grinding scrape that seemed to go on forever. Tamar stood outside the locked door, her torn robe hanging loosely around her shoulders, her hair disheveled, her face streaked with tears. The contrast was devastating. She had entered that room as a protected royal virgin, clothed in honor and innocence, and she emerged as damaged goods, cast out and abandoned. The palace corridors suddenly felt enormous and empty around her.
Servants passed by, their eyes widening in shock when they saw her condition, then quickly looking away as they realized they were witnessing something they weren't supposed to see. The whispers would start immediately, spreading through the palace like wildfire. With trembling hands, Tamar reached down and gathered ashes from a nearby brazier, placing them on her head. This was the ancient sign of mourning, the ritual gesture of someone who had suffered devastating loss. The gray dust settled into her hair and streaked down her face, mixing with her tears. Then she did something that marked the end of her life as she had known it. Tamar took hold of her torn virgin's robe, the beautiful, colorful garment that had been her badge of honor and protection, and ripped it further. The sound of tearing fabric echoed in the corridor as she destroyed the last symbol of who she used to be. She placed both hands on her head and began to walk, crying aloud as she moved. This wasn't quiet weeping. This was the kind of wailing that announced tragedy, the mourning cry that told everyone within hearing distance that something terrible had happened. The sound carried through the palace corridors, bouncing off stone walls and reaching the ears of servants, officials, and courtiers. People stopped their conversations and turned toward the sound, recognizing the voice, but shocked by the anguish in it. This was Tamar, David's daughter, crying like someone whose world had just ended. Her feet carried her through the palace grounds and into the streets of Jerusalem, tears streaming hot down her cheeks. She walked like someone in a nightmare, no longer fully aware of where she was going, driven only by the need to find safety somewhere, anywhere other than the place where she had been destroyed and discarded. People in the streets stopped and stared as she passed. The sight of a royal daughter in such a state was unprecedented. Her torn robes, the ashes in her hair, the uncontrolled weeping, all of it announced that something catastrophic had occurred in the house of David. When Tamar finally reached the house of Absalom, she was exhausted, broken, barely able to stand. Her brother saw her condition immediately, the torn clothing, the ashes, the devastated expression that told him everything he needed to know about what had happened to his sister. The desolation that would define the rest of Tamar's life was already settling over her like a shroud, marking the end of one story and the beginning of another, darker one. Absalom was waiting when Tamar stumbled to his doorstep. One look at his sister told him everything he needed to know. The ashes in her hair, the torn virgin's robe hanging in tatters around her shoulders, the hollow devastation in her eyes. These weren't ordinary grief. This was the aftermath of violence. His voice was steady when he spoke, but his eyes were already hardening with a terrible understanding. "Has Amnon, your brother, been with you?" Tamar nodded, her voice too broken for words. That simple gesture confirmed what Absalom had already suspected from the moment he saw her condition. The crown prince, their half-brother, the heir to David's throne, had done the unthinkable. 2 Samuel 13:20 records Absalom's response. "Be quiet for now, my sister. He is your brother. Do not take this thing to heart." Think about those words. Be quiet. Don't take this to heart. On the surface, they might sound like dismissal or indifference, but they were something else entirely. Absalom was giving his sister counsel born of cold political calculation. He understood that immediate outcry would accomplish nothing except to bring more shame upon Tamar, while Amnon faced no real consequences. "He is your brother," Absalom continued, and the words carried layers of meaning. Yes, Amnon was family, which made his crime even more horrific, but he was also the firstborn, the heir, the one David favored. Speaking out against him directly would likely bring punishment upon the accusers rather than justice for the victim. Absalom wasn't telling Tamar to forgive or forget, he was telling her to survive. He was buying time while his own mind worked through what needed to happen next. Tamar entered Absalom's house in silence, moving like someone walking through a nightmare. Her feet carried her forward, but her spirit remained trapped in that locked room where her life had been destroyed. Absalom closed the door behind her, sealing them both away from the curious eyes and wagging tongues that would soon be spreading rumors throughout Jerusalem. She sank to the floor without ceremony, her body shaking with tremors that had nothing to do with cold. The physical trauma was real, but the emotional devastation went deeper than anything that could be seen. Tamar sat there like someone who had died, but whose body hadn't yet realized it. Absalom brought water in a clay basin and knelt beside her. Gently, carefully, he began washing the ashes from her hair and face. The gray dust swirled in the water, turning it dark as it carried away the outward signs of her mourning, but no amount of washing could clean away what had happened to her. Tamar remained motionless during his ministrations, staring at nothing with eyes that had seen too much. She was present in body, but absent in spirit, her mind still processing trauma too large to fully comprehend. The sister who had left that morning full of purpose and kindness was gone, replaced by someone hollow and broken. Absalom wrapped her in a simple cloak, covering the ruins of her virgin's robe, the beautiful, colorful garment that had been her badge of honor and protection, and ripped it further. The sound of tearing fabric echoed in the corridor as she destroyed the last symbol of who she used to be. She placed both hands on her head and began to walk, crying aloud as she moved. This wasn't quiet weeping. This was the kind of wailing that announced tragedy, the mourning cry that told everyone within hearing distance that something terrible had happened. The sound carried through the palace corridors, bouncing off stone walls and reaching the ears of servants, officials, and courtiers. People stopped their conversations and turned toward the sound, recognizing the voice, but shocked by the anguish in it. This was Tamar, David's daughter, crying like someone whose world had just ended. Her feet carried her through the palace grounds and into the streets of Jerusalem, tears streaming hot down her cheeks. She walked like someone in a nightmare, no longer fully aware of where she was going, driven only by the need to find safety somewhere, anywhere other than the place where she had been destroyed and discarded.
People in the streets stopped and stared as she passed. The sight of a royal daughter in such a state was unprecedented. Her torn robes, the ashes in her hair, the uncontrolled weeping, all of it announced that something catastrophic had occurred in the house of David. When Tamar finally reached the house of Absalom, she was exhausted, broken, barely able to stand. Her brother saw her condition immediately. The torn clothing, the ashes, the devastated expression that told him everything he needed to know about what had happened to his sister. The desolation that would define the rest of Tamar's life was already settling over her like a shroud, marking the end of one story and the beginning of another, darker one. Absalom was waiting when Tamar stumbled to his doorstep. One look at his sister told him everything he needed to know. The ashes in her hair, the torn virgin's robe hanging in tatters around her shoulders, the hollow devastation in her eyes. These weren't ordinary grief. This was the aftermath of violence. His voice was steady when he spoke, but his eyes were already hardening with a terrible understanding. "Has Amnon, your brother, been with you?" Tamar nodded, her voice too broken for words. That simple gesture confirmed what Absalom had already suspected from the moment he saw her condition. The crown prince, their half-brother, the heir to David's throne, had done the unthinkable. 2 Samuel 13:20 records Absalom's response. "Be quiet for now, my sister. He is your brother. Do not take this thing to heart." Think about those words. Be quiet. Don't take this to heart. On the surface, they might sound like dismissal or indifference, but they were something else entirely. Absalom was giving his sister counsel born of cold political calculation. He understood that immediate outcry would accomplish nothing except to bring more shame upon Tamar, while Amnon faced no real consequences. "He is your brother," Absalom continued, and the words carried layers of meaning. Yes, Amnon was family, which made his crime even more horrific, but he was also the firstborn, the heir, the one David favored. Speaking out against him directly would likely bring punishment upon the accusers rather than justice for the victim. Absalom wasn't telling Tamar to forgive or forget, he was telling her to survive. He was buying time while his own mind worked through what needed to happen next. Tamar entered Absalom's house in silence, moving like someone walking through a nightmare. Her feet carried her forward, but her spirit remained trapped in that locked room where her life had been destroyed. Absalom closed the door behind her, sealing them both away from the curious eyes and wagging tongues that would soon be spreading rumors throughout Jerusalem. She sank to the floor without ceremony, her body shaking with tremors that had nothing to do with cold. The physical trauma was real, but the emotional devastation went deeper than anything that could be seen. Tamar sat there like someone who had died, but whose body hadn't yet realized it. Absalom brought water in a clay basin and knelt beside her. Gently, carefully, he began washing the ashes from her hair and face. The gray dust.
The giant-slaying warrior king, the man who had united Israel and defeated the Philistines, was furious when he learned what his firstborn son had done to his daughter. His wrath was real and burning, but his anger didn't translate into action. David took no steps to punish Amnon. He didn't demand justice for Tamar. He didn't even strip his son of his position as heir. The king, who had executed men for lesser crimes, somehow found no penalty severe enough for the rape of his own daughter by his own son. This inaction wounded Tamar almost as deeply as the original assault. To be violated was devastating. To be violated and then ignored by the one person with the power to demand justice was a different kind of destruction entirely. David's silence sent a clear message. Amnon's position as heir mattered more than Tamar's suffering as his daughter. The royal house was fracturing, held together now only by appearance and protocol. Hatred was growing in Absalom's heart. Shame was consuming Tamar's life, and David's failure to act was ensuring that this wouldn't be the end of the story. It would only be the beginning of something much worse. David's failure to act created a silence that became more dangerous than any outcry could have been. 2 Samuel 13:22 tells us that Absalom spoke to Amnon neither good nor bad. Think about what that means.
In a royal household where brothers regularly interacted, where palace life required constant communication between the king's sons, Absalom's complete silence toward Amnon was deafening. He didn't curse his half-brother. He didn't confront him. He didn't even acknowledge his existence. When Amnon entered a room, Absalom looked through him as if he were invisible. When court business required their presence together, Absalom conducted himself with cold professionalism that revealed nothing of the hatred burning in his heart. Meanwhile, Amnon continued his life as crown prince without consequence. He attended council meetings, received honors due to the heir, and moved through the palace as if nothing had changed. David's inaction had essentially declared that the rape of a royal daughter was not a crime worthy of punishment, at least not when the perpetrator was the future king. But Absalom was planning in secret. Every day he watched his sister living as a desolate woman in his house. He was calculating. Every time he saw Amnon enjoying his privileges as firstborn, the plan grew more detailed. This wasn't hot-blooded revenge driven by momentary anger. This was cold, methodical preparation for justice that the king had failed to deliver. 2 years passed, 2 full years of maintaining the facade while hatred festered and plans crystallized. Think about the patience that required. 730 days of watching Amnon laugh and feast and rule, while Tamar lived in broken silence. Each sunrise brought Absalom face to face with his sister's devastation and his half-brother's unpunished arrogance. Then came the sheep-shearing season at Baal-Hazor. This was Absalom's estate, his land, his workers. Sheep-shearing was traditionally a time of celebration, when landowners hosted feasts for their workers and invited family to join the festivities. It was the perfect cover for what Absalom had been planning. He extended invitations to all the king's sons. The message was delivered with all the appropriate ceremony and courtesy. "Come celebrate the harvest with me," he said. "Join me for food and wine and brotherhood. Let us feast together as sons of David should." Amnon accepted without suspicion. Why wouldn't he? 2 years had passed since the incident with Tamar. Absalom had never confronted him, never accused him, never shown any sign of holding a grudge. If anything, Absalom's silence had suggested acceptance, perhaps even approval of his right as firstborn to take what he wanted. While the invitations went out publicly, Absalom gave very different instructions to his servants in private. These were his personal attendants, men who owed their loyalty to him alone, not to David or to the royal household generally. They listened carefully to orders that would never be spoken aloud again. The day of the feast arrived with all the joy and abundance that sheep-shearing season typically brought. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted meat and fresh bread. Wine flowed freely from large clay jars, the good vintage that Absalom had been saving for special occasions. Musicians played, servants laughed, and the air filled with the sounds of celebration. Amnon drank deeply and grew merry with the wine. This was how he preferred to spend his days, surrounded by abundance, enjoying the privileges of his position, celebrating with his brothers who seemed to harbor no resentments about the past. The wine loosened his tongue and brightened his mood, washing away any lingering concerns about family tensions. From his place at the head table, Absalom watched every cup Amnon drained, every laugh that escaped his lips, every moment of carefree pleasure his half-brother enjoyed. The crown prince had no idea he was being studied with the intensity of a hunter watching prey. The wine continued to flow and Amnon continued to drink, his face flushed with alcohol and good cheer. He raised his voice in songs and jokes with the other sons of David. The festive atmosphere was infectious, and even the servants seemed caught up in the joy of the celebration. Absalom gave a discreet signal to his men. They moved into position around the tables, still appearing to serve food and wine, but now strategically placed for what would come next. Their movements were casual, unremarkable to anyone not watching for them. Amnon lifted his cup once more, the wine gleaming red in the afternoon as sun-tight. He was at his most vulnerable, drunk, relaxed, surrounded by what he believed was family loyalty. The festivity had reached its peak with laughter echoing across the fields and tables full of satisfied guests. He had no idea that 2 years of patient planning were about to culminate in blood. The moment Absalom had been waiting for was finally at hand. Justice for Tamar was about to be delivered with the edge of a sword. The moment had arrived. Absalom's voice was low but clear as he gave the command that would change everything. "Mark now when Amnon's heart is merry with wine, and when I say to you, strike Amnon, then kill him." Samuel 13:28 records these exact words. Think about the calculated coldness in that instruction. Absalom wasn't acting in hot-blooded rage. This was the culmination of 2 years of patient planning, delivered with the precision of a military commander giving orders before battle. His servants nodded their understanding. These weren't random palace workers. These were men Absalom had carefully selected and prepared for this moment. They had sworn their loyalty to him personally, and they understood that what they were about to do would either secure their futures or destroy them completely. "Do not be afraid," Absalom continued, reading the tension in their faces. "Have not I commanded you? Be courageous and be valiant." He was giving them the authority they needed to act, removing any hesitation that might come from striking down the crown prince of Israel. Amnon continued drinking, his heart growing more merry with each cup of wine. The alcohol had washed away any caution he might have possessed, any awareness that he might be in danger.
He laughed loudly with his brothers, completely absorbed in the celebration, utterly unaware that death was positioning itself around him. The irony was devastating. Amnon was enjoying himself at a feast hosted by the very brother whose sister he had violated. He was drinking wine provided by someone whose hatred he had completely underestimated. He was celebrating life at the moment when his own was about to end. Absalom watched with the cold patience of an executioner. Every laugh from Amnon's lips, every careless gesture, every moment of drunken happiness was being cataloged by someone who remembered exactly why this moment had come. 2 years of watching Tamar live in desolation had led to this. Justice delayed, but not forgotten. The signal came with subtle precision. Absalom caught the eyes of his servants and gave an almost imperceptible nod. The time had come. They moved like predators who had been stalking their prey for months. The servants positioned around the banquet table suddenly revealed the weapons they had kept hidden beneath their cloaks. Bronze blades flashed in the afternoon sunlight as they converged on Amnon's position. Amnon saw the steel coming toward him and tried to stand, but the wine had slowed his reflexes and clouded his judgment. His mouth opened to shout a warning or plea, but the words never came. The first blade found its mark before he could fully comprehend what was happening. The attack was swift and merciless. Multiple servants struck at once, their swords finding flesh with deadly accuracy. Amnon fell forward onto the table, then rolled off onto the ground as his life poured out of him. The heir to David's throne, the firstborn son of the king, the man who had thought himself untouchable, died in the dirt of a sheep-shearing festival. Blood spread across the packed earth beneath the tables. The red stain grew larger with each heartbeat, then stopped growing as Amnon's heart stopped beating. The crowned prince of Israel was dead, killed by his own brother's servants at his own brother's command. The other sons of David reacted with the terror of men who suddenly understood they might be next. Chairs overturned as they scrambled to escape. Wine cups shattered on the ground as the celebration transformed instantly into chaos and panic. "Mount your mules and flee," someone shouted, though later no one would remember who had given that command. The remaining princes ran for their animals, desperate to escape whatever broader massacre might be planned. But Absalom's servants made no move to pursue them. Their orders had been specific: kill Amnon. That task was complete. They stood firm around their master, weapons still drawn, ready to defend him if necessary, but making no aggressive moves toward anyone else. The sounds of hooves echoed across the fields as David's sons fled toward Jerusalem. They rode hard, driven by terror and the certainty they needed to reach safety as quickly as possible. Behind them, the celebration that had begun with such joy was ending in blood and death. A messenger reached David before his fleeing sons did. The report that arrived at the palace was garbled by panic and distance. Absalom has killed all the king's sons, and not one of them is left. Picture David receiving that news. The warrior king who had faced giants and armies, who had survived Saul's hatred and unified a kingdom, suddenly faced the possibility that all his sons were dead. The dynasty he had built, the future he had secured through conquest and diplomacy, might have been wiped out in a single afternoon. David tore his clothes and fell to the ground in anguish. The sound of his grief filled the palace as he mourned what he believed was the complete destruction of his family line. His servants fell beside him, sharing in the devastating loss of the royal princes. But Jonadab, the same crafty cousin who had orchestrated Tamar's rape 2 years earlier, spoke up with information that clarified the truth. "Let not my lord suppose that they have killed all the young men, the king's sons, for Amnon alone is dead." Think about Jonadab's position in this moment. He had been the architect of Amnon's opportunity to assault Tamar. Now he was explaining the consequences of that assault to the grieving father. His next words revealed how clearly he had understood what Absalom was planning. For by the appointment of Absalom, this has been determined from the day that he forced his sister Tamar. Jonadab had seen the hatred growing in Absalom's eyes. He had watched the careful planning, the patient waiting, the methodical preparation for revenge. What looked like sudden violence to everyone else had been inevitable to someone who understood the depth of Absalom's commitment to justice. David's grief shifted but didn't diminish. Instead of mourning all his sons, he was now mourning one son and facing the reality that another had become a murderer and fugitive. The royal family was fracturing in ways that couldn't be repaired. Absalom didn't linger at the scene of his revenge. The moment Amnon's blood hit the ground, Absalom was already moving toward his escape route. He mounted his horse and rode hard toward the border, knowing that staying in Israel meant facing his father's justice or his father's army. He crossed into Geshur, the kingdom of his maternal grandfather Talmai, as fast as his horse could carry him. There he would find protection, sanctuary from David's reach, and time to live with the consequences of what he had done. Back in Jerusalem, David mourned for Amnon daily. The palace fell into heavy mourning for the crown prince, who had died violently at his own brother's hand. The future of the kingdom suddenly seemed uncertain, with the heir dead and his killer in exile. When the news of Amnon's death reached Tamar, she received it in silence. After 2 years of living in desolation, after watching her rapist continue to enjoy his privileges while she suffered in broken silence, the news that justice had finally come carried complex emotions. Relief, perhaps. Vindication, certainly. But also the heavy knowledge that her violation had now cost 2 brothers their lives and their father his peace. The house of David had lost another son, but the price of that loss would prove to be far higher than anyone yet understood. The cycle of violence that had begun with Amnon's obsession was far from over. Absalom's horse carried him swiftly across the border into Geshur, the land of his mother, Merah. This wasn't random flight. This was calculated escape to the one place where David's authority couldn't reach him. Geshur was an independent kingdom ruled by King Talmai, Absalom's maternal grandfather, and ancient treaties protected those who sought sanctuary there. Talmai received his grandson without hesitation. The old king had heard the reports of what had transpired at the sheep-shearing festival, and he understood exactly why Absalom had come.
Blood had been answered with blood, and now the avenger needed protection from the consequences of his justice. Absalom took up residence in his grandfather's palace, but this wasn't a comfortable exile. He was a man without a country, cut off from the inheritance that should have been his as a son of David. Every day in Geshur was a reminder that he had traded his future in Israel for the satisfaction of killing Amnon. 2 Samuel 13:38 tells us he fled and went to Geshur and was there 3 years. 3 full years. Think about what that meant.
Over 1,000 days of separation from everything he had known, from the palace where he had grown up, from the sister he had avenged, from the father whose love he still craved despite everything. Back in Jerusalem, time worked its gradual healing on David's grief. The sharp edge of mourning for Amnon slowly dulled into a manageable ache. The king still missed his firstborn son, but the immediate devastation had faded enough for other emotions to emerge. 2 Samuel 13:39 records the change, and King David longed to go forth to Absalom, for he was comforted concerning Amnon, seeing he was dead. David's heart began to turn toward his exiled son. The anger over Amnon's murder was being overtaken by a father's longing for his living child. Joab noticed the change in his master's demeanor. The experienced general had served David for years and could read the king's moods better than anyone. He saw how David's eyes would grow distant when reports came from Geshur. He observed the way the king would ask casual questions about conditions in that kingdom, as if he weren't really thinking about his exiled son. David wanted Absalom back, but his pride and his position prevented him from saying so directly. A king couldn't simply recall a son who had committed murder at a royal feast. There had to be a process, a face-saving way to bring about reconciliation without appearing to condone the killing. Joab decided to help create that process. Meanwhile, Tamar remained in her desolate state, living quietly in the house that had once belonged to Absalom. Her protector and avenger was gone, fled to a foreign land because of what he had done for her. The silence of her days was broken only by the knowledge that Amnon was dead. Justice had been served, but at a cost that left her more isolated than ever. In Geshur, Absalom's hair grew long during his exile. This wasn't mere vanity. It was a visible sign of his separation from the customs and requirements of court life. In the palace, royal appearance was carefully maintained. In exile, he could let his hair grow wild, a symbol of how far he had fallen from his former position. Years passed without reconciliation. David never sent official word calling for Absalom's return, though his private longing grew stronger with each season. Absalom never sent formal requests for forgiveness, though he surely missed the power and privilege he had left behind. Both father and son were trapped by pride and protocol, each waiting for the other to make the first move. Joab grew tired of watching this standoff. He knew David wanted his son back, and he suspected Absalom would welcome the opportunity to return. What was needed was a way to break the deadlock without either party losing face. Joab's solution was characteristically clever. He sent for a wise woman from the city of Tekoa, a place known for producing people skilled in parables and persuasive speech. This woman had a reputation for being able to present difficult truths in ways that kings could accept without feeling challenged. She arrived at the palace dressed in mourning clothes, playing the role of a grieving widow seeking the king's justice. Before David, she told an elaborate story about 2 sons who had fought, resulting in one brother killing the other. Now she claimed her family wanted to execute the surviving son, which would leave her with no heir and no protection. David listened with the attention he gave to all petitioners seeking royal justice. The case seemed straightforward, a family matter requiring the king's wisdom to prevent further tragedy. "As the Lord lives," David promised, "not one hair of your son shall fall to the ground." He was guaranteeing protection for the surviving son, preventing the family from carrying out their planned execution. The woman's response revealed the true purpose of her visit. "Let your handmaid speak one word to my lord the king," she said, and then drew the parallel that Joab had coached her to make. "Why?" she asked.
Did the king promise protection for her fictional son while keeping his own son in exile for a similar crime? David immediately understood that he had been maneuvered. Joab had orchestrated this entire encounter to force him to confront his own inconsistency. The king had just promised mercy for a stranger's son while maintaining justice against his own. The plan worked. David gave Joab permission to bring Absalom back to Jerusalem, though he imposed one crucial condition. Absalom could return to his own house, but he would not be permitted to see the king's face. It was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but allowed movement toward eventual reconciliation. Absalom returned from his 3-year exile, but the reunion with his father would have to wait. Absalom returned to Jerusalem, but the homecoming was hollow. He lived in his own house for 2 full years without seeing his father's face. 2 Samuel 14:28 tells us the painful reality. So Absalom lived for 2 full years in Jerusalem without coming into the king's presence. Think about what those 2 years meant. Absalom was back in the city where he had grown up, walking the same streets where he had once enjoyed royal privilege, but he was essentially a ghost in his own life. He could see the palace where his father lived, but he couldn't enter. He could hear news of court proceedings, but he couldn't participate. He was home, but he wasn't truly restored. The frustration of this liminal existence finally drove Absalom to desperate action. He needed to force a confrontation to break the deadlock that kept him suspended between exile and restoration. His solution was characteristically bold and destructive. Absalom set Joab's barley field on fire. The flames consumed the grain that Joab had carefully cultivated, destroying months of work in a matter of hours. The smoke rising from the burning field was visible throughout Jerusalem, a signal that couldn't be ignored. Absalom had deliberately attacked the property of the man who had arranged his return, knowing that such an act would demand immediate response. Joab arrived at Absalom's house furious, his face dark with anger over the destruction of his harvest. "Why have your servants set my field on fire?" he demanded. Absalom's response was direct and unapologetic. "Look, I sent to you saying, 'Come here,' so that I may send you to the king to say, 'Why have I come from Geshur? It would be better for me to be there still.'" He was forcing Joab to confront the absurdity of the situation. What was the point of returning from exile if he remained cut off from his father? "Now therefore, Absalom," he continued, "let me see the king's face. But if there is iniquity in me, let him execute me." It was an ultimatum wrapped in apparent submission. Either restore me fully or kill me outright. This half-existence was worse than exile. Joab understood the message. The burning field had been Absalom's way of demanding action, and the demand couldn't be ignored any longer. Joab went to David and reported Absalom's words, making it clear that the current situation was unsustainable. Finally, David agreed to see his son. The reunion was formal, heavy with years of separation and unspoken grief. As 2 Samuel 14:33 records the moment, "So Joab went to the king and told him, and he summoned Absalom. So he came to the king and bowed himself on his face to the ground before the king. And the king kissed Absalom. Absalom prostrated himself completely, his face pressed to the floor in absolute submission. This was the gesture of someone acknowledging not just royal authority, but also paternal forgiveness. The proud prince who had killed his brother and fled to Geshur was humbling himself before the father he had wronged. David's response was the kiss of reconciliation, not words of forgiveness. Those would have required acknowledging the crime that had never been properly addressed, but the physical gesture that restored relationship, that brought his son back into the circle of family acceptance. Life moved forward from that moment, but the scars remained. Absalom married and had children, 3 sons whose names aren't recorded, and 1 daughter who mattered more than all the rest. 2 Samuel 14:27 tells us about that daughter. To Absalom there were born 3 sons and 1 daughter, whose name was Tamar. She was a woman of fair appearance. He named her Tamar. Think about what that meant. Absalom gave his daughter the same name as his violated sister.
ensuring that the memory of what had happened would echo through generations. The new Tamar grew up beautiful, just like her aunt, but she would grow up in a world where her very name carried the weight of family tragedy. Meanwhile, the original Tamar remained desolate in her quiet existence. She had received justice through Amnon's death, but justice hadn't restored her life. She was still the broken woman who lived in Absalom's house, still carrying the consequences of violence that had been done to her years before. The name Tamar became both burden and honor in David's family. It remembered the innocent daughter who had been destroyed, but it also carried forward beauty and dignity through the next generation. The new Tamar would grow up knowing the story of her namesake, understanding that her beauty came with both privilege and danger. But Absalom's ambitions didn't end with family reconciliation. He began appearing at the city gates, the place where legal disputes were settled and political influence was exercised. He would rise early and position himself where people came seeking justice from the king, intercepting them with sympathetic words and attractive promises. "If only I were judge in the land," he would say to those seeking redress, "then every man who has any suit or cause might come to me, and I would give him justice." He was systematically undermining his father's authority, while presenting himself as a more accessible, more caring alternative to David's rule. The cycle of violence that had begun with Amnon's obsession was continuing in new forms. David's failure to act decisively after Tamar's rape had set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately cost him his kingdom, his family's unity, and nearly his life. The original inaction, David's refusal to punish Amnon, had created space for vigilante justice. That vigilante justice had required exile. The exile had fostered resentment. The resentment had grown into political rebellion. Each failure to address the fundamental problem had multiplied the consequences. Tamar lived in the shadow of what had happened to her, but her story had become larger than her personal tragedy. Her name would be remembered, carried forward by her beautiful niece, preserved as both warning and memorial. The House of David would never fully recover from the fractures that began with one brother's obsession and another brother's silence. The price of inaction had proven to be higher than anyone could have calculated, costing lives, relationships, and ultimately the stability of the kingdom itself. David was learning too late that some decisions cannot be avoided, and that failing to choose justice is itself a choice with devastating consequences. If this story affected you the way I promised at the beginning, subscribe to the channel now for more biblical narratives told in a way you rarely hear. Share this video with someone who needs to understand the weight of the decisions we make or the ones we choose not to make. Leave a comment below. What impacted you the most? Tamar's violation, Absalom's revenge, David's deadly silence, or the consequences that echoed through generations? Thank you for staying until the end of this brutal but necessary story. May God bless you, and I'll see you in the next video.